All right. Let's talk a little bit about American history and some things you might not have known. People who were slave owners and or who profited from the slave trade. Because American history teachers know how important it is to teach the horrors of slavery. No one can disagree with that. Not only so that the same mistakes will never, ever, ever happen again, but because of the long-term oppression and cruelty toward black people. It extends, to a certain extent, even to the modern times in important cultural issues such as police brutality and a cycle of poverty that is directly linked to racism caused by slavery. We have to admit that. However, what is not taught is that there were many black people who not only participated in the slave trade, but who often profited greatly from it. They actually owned slaves themselves as property in order to enhance their own economic well-being by having free labor for their plantations. Now, a lot of them were biracial children of former white masters and were either freed or were left some property in a will. The American South's history is infamous for using slaves on their large plantations, no doubt about that. And many of the black slave owners that we're going to talk about tonight are from South Carolina and Louisiana. Some were even considered what is called slave magnates. That is, anyone who owned more than 50 slaves was known as a slave magnate. But others earned their place simply for their unique stories. And tonight I want to bring these stories to light for you. And I hope you'll appreciate some of the things that we're going to talk about right here. Now, the first one I want to bring to your attention is a guy by the name of Nat Butler. Nat Butler. Now, Nat Butler makes this list for the special type of manipulative cruelty that he showed toward his fellow human beings. Let me see if we have a picture of Nat Butler. Do we have a picture of Nat Butler here? Yeah, I think I do. Let me get him up here so that you can see. That's a picture of Nat Butler, okay? Butler was one of the worst kinds of slave owners. Not only did he participate in the slave trade, he actively tricked slaves into running away so that he could sell them back to their masters. Butler would, for example, convince a slave to hide out on his property. Butler would then sneak to the slave owners to find out what the reward was for returning them. If the reward was high, he would simply return the slave for the money. But if the price was low, Butler would buy the slave and then resell him to slave dealers down south for a profit. He gained a bad reputation in his county for his scheming actions, and many attempted to hurt and even murder him for revenge. That is Nat Butler. Then we have Justice Angel and Mistress L. Horry. Justice Angel and Mistress L. Horry were wealthy black masters who owned 84 slaves, or 168 together. In other words, each of them owned 84, or 168 slaves between the two of them. Now, they were located in Colleton District, now Charleston County in South Carolina, in 1830. Because most slave owners only had a handful of slaves, Angel and Horry were considered economic elite and were called slave magnates. Slaves were simply labor to Angel and Horry, and they considered them property, hunting down runaway slaves and punishing misbehaving ones. And while there is no evidence that they treated their slaves more harshly than any other slave owners, they were known to own them strictly for business purposes. They bought, sold, and traded them like property, and misbehaving slaves were punished harshly for interfering with profits. All right, interesting. Then we have, if we can find them here, there they are, Widow C. Richards and son P.C. Richards. In 1860, slave owners, white or black, owned around 1 to 5 slaves on average. About 28% of the free black population in New Orleans at the time owned slaves, with at least 6 owning 65 or more. C. Richards and her son P.C. go above and beyond these other 6 slave owners by owning over twice as many. The widow and her son operated a large sugar plantation together and owned more slaves than all other black slave owners in Louisiana in 1860, topping off at 152. Then we have the Pendarvis family, if we can find them. We have the Pendarvis family. I want to put up pictures of these people, or a depiction of them anyway. During the 1730s, the Pendarvis family was one of the most prominent in the South, owning the biggest rice plantations in the Palmetto region and over 123 slaves. They dominated Colleton County, now the Charleston area, and became one of the wealthiest slave-holding families in South Carolina. What is ironic is that this family of wealthy black slave owners was given their wealth accidentally when a will was created that gave the estate of Joseph Pendarvis to his illegitimate children with his slave Parthena. Despite the family's own origins, all Pendarvis estates continued to use slave labor as they took over the Palmetto state. Then we have Marie Therese Metodier. Marie was living in the Kingdom of Congo when she met her future husband, who fell deeply in love with her. In a time where interracial marriage was considered wrong and immoral, Marie married a white Frenchman named Claude Metoyer and moved to Louisiana with him and their children. Because their marriage was not approved by society, Marie technically remained a slave to her husband. Years later, and after 6 children, Marie was finally freed, and she and her husband divorced. Claude left for France, where he married a French woman. Marie wasn't left with nothing, however, and started a plantation that initially dealt in tobacco. Under Marie's leadership, the Metoyer family prospered, and the plantation grew. Eventually, they owned more slaves than any other family in their county, with the number being reported at 287 by 1830. There isn't much evidence of harsh treatment to their own slaves, but the Metoyers were notorious for buying extra slaves to do the hardest tasks on the plantation and then returning them after the work was finished. This prevented them from having their own slaves do the dirty work. Then we have Antoine Dubuclet. Antoine Dubuclet was born a free man to free parents and inherited a large sugar plantation called Cedar Grove from his father. Under his father, the plantation was small and contained only a few slaves. Under Antoine's leadership, it grew, and by 1860 he owned over 100 slaves and had one of the largest sugar plantations in Louisiana. He was extremely wealthy, even more so than any of his white neighbors. His plantation was worth $264,000, while the average income of his neighbors in the South was only around $3,978. After marrying a wealthy black woman, his lands expanded, and after her death, Dubuclet was considered the wealthiest black slave owner in Louisiana. He was elected and served as state treasurer during the Reconstruction era, one of the only black men to hold the office for more than one term. Then we have William April Ellison. In 1862, William Ellison was one of the largest slave owners in South Carolina, as well as one of the wealthiest. He was born a slave and was given the name April after the month in which he was born. He was luckier than most and was bought by a white slave owner named William Ellison, who took the time to educate him. When he was 26 years old, he was freed by his master and began building his expansive cotton plantation. As a free man, he had his name changed to William Ellison, that of his former owner. Now, what makes Ellison so despicable and earns him the number 2 spot on this list of top 8 slave owners who happen to be black is how he collected his wealth. Ellison was known to have made a large portion of his money as a slave breeder. Breeding slaves was illegal in many southern states, but Ellison secretly sold almost all females born, keeping a select few for future breeding. He kept many of the young males as they were considered useful on his plantation. Ellison was known to be a harsh master, and his slaves were almost starved and extremely poorly clothed. He kept a windowless building on his property for the specific purpose of chaining his misbehaving slaves. And then we have the number 1 African-American, I guess at the time just considered black, slave owner, Anthony Johnson. Nobody on this list has affected the history of slavery quite as much as Anthony Johnson. He's rumored to have been the first black man to arrive in Virginia, as well as the first black indentured servant in America. He was also the first black man to gain his freedom and the first to own land. And as a true pioneer of firsts, well, Johnson couldn't stop there. Ironically, he became the first black slave owner, and it was his court case that solidified slavery in America. In 1635, Johnson was freed and given a 250-acre plantation where he was master over both black and white servants. In 1654, Johnson sued his neighbor in a case that would change America's history forever. Johnson's servant, John Casor, claimed he was an indentured servant who had worked several years past the terms of his indenture for Johnson and was now working for Johnson's neighbor Parker. Johnson sued Parker, stated that Casor was his servant in perpetuity, and the courts ruled in his favor. Casor had to return to Johnson, and the case established the principle in America that one person is able to own another person for the rest of their life. Think about that, folks. So those are some black people who actually owned slaves here in the United States of America. So to those who are under the impression that it was only, whites that owned slaves, that's not necessarily true. Now, in addition to some black people owning slaves, there were blacks who actually acquired wealth during slavery. Some very plucky African Americans managed to escape this dire fate of slavery and went on to live illustrious lives, acquiring wealth and status that other colonists could only envy. Some of these individuals did so through luck, some through wherewithal, but in any case were able to overcome the status quo and triumph in spite of a system which was rigged against them. Now, they should serve as an inspiration and a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the will to succeed. Let's talk about these people. Paul Cuffey, a prodigious sea captain and an entrepreneur, born in 1759. His father, Cuffey Slocum, was a freed slave, and his mother was a Native American named Ruth Moses. Paul Cuffey grew up in Massachusetts as the youngest of 10 children. Although he had no formal education, he was able to learn arithmetic and navigation through a family friend. He taught himself to read and write and held various jobs as a farmer, carpenter, and fisherman. In 1776, his hard work earned him enough money to purchase a 116-acre farm in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. Cuffey managed to build a lucrative shipping business and established the first racially integrated school in Westport, Massachusetts. He was also credited as the first free African-American to visit the White House and meet with the sitting president. Cuffey was politically active and sought to establish a prosperous colony for black people and to return to Africa. Cuffey died in 1817 and left behind an estate with an estimated value of almost $20,000, which today equates to roughly $500,000. All right. And we also have Robert Gordon. Where is Robert Gordon? Let's talk a little bit. Here's Robert Gordon, or at least a depiction of Robert Gordon. Robert Gordon was a former slave who bought his freedom in 1846. He went into business as a coal dealer in 1847 after investing $15,000 in a Cincinnati coal yard. He was met with aggressive opposition from white coal dealers who attempted to run Gordon out of business by slashing their prices. Rather than do the same, Gordon decided to stockpile his own coal supply. Then he hired biracial men who could pass as whites to buy up the cheaper coal from the competitors. When freezing weather prevented suppliers from using the waterways to deliver new coal, the coal reserves of Gordon's competitors dwindled while his thrived. His shrewd business tactic allowed Robert Gordon to win the Coal War and earned him the respect amongst white coal dealers. And then we have, let's see what else we have. Samuel T. Wilcox. Samuel Wilcox was a highly successful black businessman in Cincinnati. He went into business as a grocer in 1850, establishing a high-end grocery store of a scale never seen before, at least up until that time, in America. He sold only premium quality goods such as hams, dried fruit, sugar, and soaps. His customer base was largely affluent, upper-crust members of society. He started business with $25,000 and made $100,000 to $140,000 in annual sales, which equates to around $4.2 million in today's money. His business later declined due to Wilcox's negligence and taste for an extravagant lifestyle. His estate had an estimated worth of $60,000. William Alexander Leidesdorff Jr. William Alexander Leidesdorff Jr. was a mixed-race man who rose to great distinction. His father was a Danish sugar planter, and his mother was an American of Spanish and African descent. In 1841, Leidesdorff Jr. arrived in California via a 106-ton schooner called Julia Ann. He set about establishing numerous business ventures, including a successful shipyard, lumberyard, and ship chandlery shop. He served as treasurer in San Francisco and built the city's first hotel. Leidesdorff Jr. is regarded as the first millionaire in America of black descent. In 1856, his estate was valued at $1.4 million, which is equivalent to over $20 million today. James Forten was an accomplished Philadelphia-born free black man. He was born September the 2nd, 1766, and joined the Continental Navy at age 15. He survived capture by the British when they seized the Royal Louis, a vessel on which he was a crewman. After that ordeal, he undertook an apprenticeship as a sail maker. He invented a sail-making device that brought him great fortune. By the 1830s, his estimated worth was $100,000, which equates to roughly $2.5 million in today's money. Forten became a leader in the black community and advocated for the abolishment of slavery. He refused to do business with slave trade vessels, and he invested his money into anti-slavery initiatives. He also helped to enlist 2,500 black volunteers to defend Philadelphia during the War of 1812. Amanda America Dixon was a biracial woman who became one of the wealthiest African-American women in 19th century America. Although she was born into slavery in 1849, Amanda enjoyed a more privileged childhood than other black girls. Her father was a white Georgia plantation owner, and her mother was a slave girl whom he had raped when she was only 12. Amanda was raised by her white grandmother, with whom she had a close relationship. She learned to read and write and play piano and was sheltered away from the harsh reality of her maternal cousins and what they experienced. When Amanda's father died in 1885, she was bequeathed most of his estate, including 17,000 acres of land, much to the chagrin of her snubbed white relatives. Amanda later left the plantation and moved into a racially integrated, affluent community in Augusta, Georgia. She attended Atlanta University, married her white cousin Charles Eubanks, and later remarried a fellow upper-class biracial man named Nathan Toomer. Amanda died June 11, 1893, of neurasthenia. That's nervous exhaustion, neurasthenia, excuse me. And we also have Bridget Mason. There she is, Bridget Mason. Bridget Mason, a.k.a. Biddy, was a black female slave who later gained her freedom thanks to the help of her white son-in-law, Charles Owens. Bridget birthed 3 daughters, each of whom was fathered by her slave master, Robert Smith. After converting to Mormonism, Smith and his wife moved to Utah in a wagon, forcing Bridget to follow on foot. A church leader tried to convince Smith to free his slaves, but Smith was unwilling. The church leader did, however, persuade Smith to move to California, which Smith was likely unaware had entered the Union as a free state. Bridget Mason obtained her freedom in 1856 and worked as a nurse in Los Angeles. She eventually saved enough money to purchase 2 estates, making her one of the first black women to own property in Los Angeles. Over several years, she bought and managed more property. She leased out this property commercially and sold portions of it. As Los Angeles grew, so did the value of her real estate. In 1872, she financed the city's first black church. By the late 1800s, Mason had acquired a fortune of $300,000, making her the wealthiest black woman in the city. So some people within the African American community profited from slavery, and several of them were slave owners themselves. It's a part of history that I'm afraid many of us were not aware, including probably some in the African American community. Just keeping you informed, folks, just letting you know. This is David Zublik with Dark Outpost. I invite you to like our Facebook page, facebook.com.